After another completely dominant weekend, the SEC is on pace to have the greatest single season for a conference in college hoops history.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What's up, folks? Happy Monday and welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, a daily national college hoop show, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host for today's show, Andy Patton, and you are listening at the place to get your college basketball content every single day, Monday through Friday, every single week of the year. Want to remind you all that you can check out this show ad-free on Amazon Music and give a special shout out to our everyday listeners and those of you hanging out with us in the Locked On College Basketball Discord channel. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Folks, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel. New customers can place a $5 bet, and if you win, you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets. Just visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Well, UConn handed Gonzaga a second straight loss in what was otherwise not a good weekend for the Big East. We're going to talk about that. We got some other results from this weekend to get to close out the show, including a surprise team that remains undefeated this season. But we're going to start continuing a conversation that has kind of been going throughout the entirety of this college basketball season, and really even starting before that in the preseason, about the depth and dominance of the Southeastern Conference, the SEC, vaunted forever for their success in football. While I know that their conversations about their football right now is different than what we're used to, there is zero debate that this is the best conference in college basketball. They are completely and utterly dominating. We have seen it not just from the advanced metrics, the analytics, things of that nature, but just the head-to-head results. They went head-to-head with the ACC earlier this month and crushed them. And then over this past weekend, 13 games on Saturday, 1 game on Sunday, 4 teams in the Big East, and 14 games on Saturday, 1 game on Sunday. 15 of the teams were in action this weekend, and the SEC as a conference went 14-1. The first weekend of the season in November, your power conference goes 14-1. You probably think, all right, that makes sense. Mostly we're playing, SWAC teams or other bye games, and it's not that big of a deal. You're expecting most power conference teams are 2-0, 3-0 to start the year, just because that's kind of how a lot of teams treat their very early season games. That's not the case with the SEC this past weekend. The SEC went 3-0 against the Big Ten. They went 2-0 against the Big 12, 1-0 against the Big East, 1-1 against the ACC. The only loss for the entire conference over this weekend was LSU losing by 10 points to SMU, which is not a great loss for LSU, not a great loss for the SEC, but not exactly a terrible loss either. SMU has been very good this year, playing better basketball than a lot of people would have expected. Also, LSU is the 14th best team in the SEC, so you can stomach your 14th best team losing to a pretty good team in the ACC when everybody else is getting it done. There's also 7-0 against mid-major clubs. A lot of the teams that they played were not very good, but there were 2 very good mid-major teams that played SEC teams this weekend, McNeeley and Grand Canyon, who both took losses. This was just an absolute destruction by the SEC over the weekend. Starting with the Big Ten games, we had Texas A&M take down Purdue. That was a big, big win for Buzz Williams and the Aggies, 70-66. The final score there was a fun game to watch. A&M just kind of imposed what they wanted to do, out-rebounded Purdue. The guards weren't able to get going what they wanted to get going. This was a really nice performance from them. Tennessee beat Illinois, the number 1 ranked team, playing an unranked team in Illinois. So it's expected that Tennessee would win, even though it was a true road game, and it wasn't easy. Jordan Gainey literally had to hit a game-winning layup over Kasparis Jakusionis in order to get the W for the Vols. They will likely stay number 1 this week, even though Auburn, who's number 2, absolutely obliterated their opponent. Tennessee needed a game winner to get by Illinois. Auburn beat Ohio State handily, 91-53, and somehow, for anybody who watched this game, you'll know what I mean. It didn't even seem that close. That score almost feels generous to Ohio State. Auburn just obliterated, thrashed the Buckeyes in this game, a 2020 game for Johni Broome. They are playing phenomenal basketball right now. I'll tell you right now, I'm going to have Auburn as my number 1 team, even though Tennessee was number 1 last week. I had them last week. A lot of other people did too, obviously. I've seen what I need to see from Auburn. Until they get dethroned, they are the best team in college basketball. They have looked like it. I know Ohio State has been struggling lately, but man, what an absolutely dominant performance from Bruce Pearl and the Tigers. Against the Big 12, Florida got by Arizona State 83-66. A result you would have expected, although a shout out to Arizona State, who's played very well this season. They've played a competitive schedule. This isn't the kind of a 17-point victory over Arizona State last year maybe wouldn't turn a lot of heads, but this Arizona State team's pretty good, and Florida didn't make it look difficult at all. And then Oklahoma beats their rival, Oklahoma State. The Sooners still undefeated on the year after winning the battle for Atlantis. They win this game against the Pokes 80-65. Going over to the Big East game, Alabama knocking off Creighton. Creighton playing without Pop Isaacs, who will be out for the rest of the season. A tough loss for Greg McDermott's team. Mark Sears finally looked back like himself. He's kind of hasn't been playing quite like himself to start the season. I think he had 27 here for the Crimson Tide against this Creighton club. And then the one win for the SEC over the ACC was Kentucky, playing their rival Louisville. 93-85 was the final score at Rupp Arena. Lamont Butler hit 6 threes in this game for Kentucky. His return after a rolled ankle kept him out of the game against Gonzaga last week. They needed him back because Kirk Kriisa underwent surgery and is out for the time being. Lamont Butler had made 7 threes on the season prior to making 6 of them against Louisville. And again, 7-0 against mid-majors. Mississippi State 3-point win over McNeese. Georgia 5-point win, over Grand Canyon. The other games were against not very good teams, but it's worth pointing out when you play bad teams, you don't need to, but when you establish a comfortable 20, 25, 30 plus point win over those teams, it's going to help you from a metrics perspective. It's going to help with the net rankings. It's going to help with all the analytics and Ken Pom and Torvik and everything. And that's what we saw. The SEC had 5 games against opponents that they were very, very, very much expected to win, but they won every single one of them by 20 or more points. Ole Miss beat Southern Miss by 31. Missouri beat Long Island by 27. Arkansas beat Central Arkansas by 25. South Carolina beat South Carolina Upstate by 20. And then on Sunday, the only SEC game that took place on Sunday, Texas played Arkansas Pine Bluff. Yes, it is worth acknowledging that Arkansas Pine Bluff at the time of the game was 362nd out of 364 Division I teams. So there's no doubt that Texas is going to win this game. But anytime you win a game by 64 points, which was the result here, 121-57 was the final score. You even beating a D2 team by 64 points is a tremendous accomplishment. Rodney Terry's team went insane against Ark Pine Bluff, 64-point win, just to really put a big stamp on what an incredible weekend this was for the SEC. Every single team in the conference is in the top 68 at KenPom as I'm currently recording this. Literally 16 teams in this conference, all of them are top 68. We know that being top 68 at KenPom is not just a recipe to make the NCAA tournament. That's not how it works. But the fact that all of these teams are in that range, in that conversation, is completely insane. 5 teams in the top 11, 8 teams in the top 30, 12 teams in the top 40, 13 in the top 50, because I think Missouri is 49th. At this point. So 13 of their teams are top 50 in the country. All 16 are in the top 68. The record, in case you're wondering, and you should be at this point, the record for number of teams from a single conference to make the same NCAA tournament is 11. It was set by the Big East back in 2011, a year before the Big East kind of had their falling apart and then their rebuild after that. It feels fairly safe as you can make any kind of prediction about the NCAA tournament field in mid-December. But it feels fairly safe that the SEC will at least be in the double digits, probably tie, if not break that record. And we kind of expect that that's a record that won't be held for very long, even if the SEC doesn't happen to break it this year, just because of the consolidation of conferences that we've seen. There used to be a Power 6 in college basketball, the Power 5, including the Pac-12 and the Big East. Now it's down to just a Power 5 because the Pac-12 has disbanded and teams. None of those teams directly went to the SEC, but of course the Big 12 backfilled from the Pac-12 after losing Texas and Oklahoma to the SEC. We're seeing these conferences consolidate and get bigger, and it makes sense with the amount of money flowing through these programs as well. Programs that have super successful football teams, like many of the SEC teams do, are going to have a huge influx of cash cash. That cash is going to not all go to the football team. Some of it's going to go to basketball, enough that we're being able to see these teams build some really strong programs. I don't want to say that it's only NIL that is allowing them to be this successful. Obviously coaches, which again is going to come down to money in some capacity, but so far this has been a completely unprecedented dominant season for the SEC. As of, again, this recording right now, the net rating for the SEC, according to KenPom, is plus 19.89. Net rating is basically an evaluation of a team that is perceived to go 500 in that conference play. How much better than perfectly average would that team be, like across all of college basketball? And again, for the SEC, plus 19.89. Second place is the Big 12 at plus 16.6. Third place is the Big 10, 16.5. So the Big 10 and the Big 12 are basically right next to each other, 0.1 difference between those two, whereas the SEC is just way ahead of both of them. It is hard to understate how incredible this conference has been. There's some big time matchups coming up for the conference. Clemson and South Carolina play on Tuesday. I believe North Carolina is playing they're playing somebody in the SEC, or Florida, excuse me. North Carolina and Florida are playing on Tuesday. Clemson and South Carolina also playing on Tuesday. Two more opportunities for the SEC to potentially pick up. If they would go 2-0 in those games, I think Florida certainly can beat North Carolina, may even be favored to beat North Carolina in that one. The game is in Charlotte. South Carolina beating Clemson would be a bit of a surprise result there, although I believe that game is a home game for the Gamecocks. So if they can pick that one up, that's even more kind of fuel to the fire that the SEC is perhaps having the best season we've ever seen from any conference in college basketball so far in 24-25. Well, we're going to move on to talk about the Big East, because UConn bounced back from their disastrous trip to Hawaii. They've now won 4 straight, including this win over Gonzaga at Madison Square Garden. Part of a not great weekend for at least the top of the Big East, but UConn certainly helps elevate that. We're going to talk about that and the rest of the results from that conference coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, get ready to tackle the rest of the season's NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Because right now, new customers can bet $5, and if you win, you'll get $150 in bonus bets. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more, all on the same page where you place those bets. And look, folks, Monday's slate of games, it's not very exciting. Tons of great action this weekend. Not surprising to see things really slow down as we get into the holidays, the Christmas break, etc. However, there is a very fun game going on between Grand Canyon and Louisiana Tech, two of the better mid-major programs in college basketball. It's a road game for Grand Canyon, but they are favored right now by 1.5. If you got the itch to watch some great mid-major basketball on Monday and you want to throw some money down, Lope's looking pretty good right now. We'll see if they can go get a W on the road. Just visit FanDuel.com to bet on that, or there's future odds for the national championship, for the Final Four, for conference winners, all that at FanDuel.com. As a reminder, you will get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win that first $5 bet. That's FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NFL. All right, folks, segment 2, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast. And we're still talking about a great weekend of college basketball games. We talked about the SEC, who went a blistering 14-1 with 7 wins over high major programs this past weekend. Now we're going to talk about the Big East. Big East as a conference went 3-6 on Saturday. Rough time for the top of the league in particular. But the major storyline coming out of the Big East was the win for the UConn Huskies. Danny Hurley's team takes down Gonzaga 77-71, the final score at the Madison Square Garden on Saturday. It was a pretty rough shooting night for both teams. UConn won despite shooting under 21% from 3. Gonzaga came into this game with one of the best three-point defenses in the entire country, had held teams to 23-ish% coming into the game. And I would have told you, in fact, I did. If you listen to Locked On Zags, I would have said there's not a chance that percentage of how opponents are shooting against Gonzaga is going to go down after the UConn game. But in fact, that is the case. UConn struggled. Alex Caravan didn't shoot it very well, but they still get the W here in huge part because of star freshman Liam McNeeley. Tremendous game from him, 26 points. He had 8 rebounds and 4 assists. He was 7 of 13 from the field. He made 10 of 12 from the free throw line. Really, really nice stuff from the freshman. The movement shooting, the decision-making, the passing just looked looked like the pro out there. I mean, Danny Hurley talked about him being kind of a Cam Spencer replacement, and it felt like a lot to put on a true freshman to play the way that a fifth-year senior did for this team last year. And McNeeley still got some stuff to work on and some consistency things, but in a game where they needed him to play well, in a game where Samson Johnson was out for most of the second half, in a game where Alex Caravan wasn't shooting well, they really needed him, and he stepped up and got it done for the Huskies. They've won 4 in a row. They beat Baylor. They beat Texas on the road. Now they beat Gonzaga. That's a really nice stretch of games for Danny Hurley's team. They're putting Hawaii in the rearview mirror. They did not do well out in Maui. Everybody knows it. You know it. I know it. We've all talked about it. 0-3, 8th out of 8 in that Maui Invitational. Got whacked by Dayton in that seventh place game. Lost by 18 in that one. But here they go out and get themselves a third straight, really, really nice win. For the Zags, second straight loss. First time they've lost back-to-back games since 2018, which I think says a lot more about just the quality of Mark Few's program and their ability to bounce back from losses. They lost last week against Kentucky, spent the whole week in finals, and I think just struggled to get up for this one. 2 of their starters in particular really dragged them down. Graham Ike, who's struggled throughout the year. It's not been a secret. He had a great first half against Kentucky. He had a great second half against San Diego State. Outside of those 2 halves, Graham Ike hasn't played really well at all. Frankly, he just has not been good. And in a game where the Zags really needed him, especially once Johnson was out of the game and Terrace Reed was in foul trouble, he just didn't deliver. 3 points, 1 assist. He only played 12 minutes. He had 4 fouls, 1 of 3 shooting. Nolan Hickman, a steadying presence for this team for the past 3 years, a senior, their best 3-point shooter. He didn't even score. He only played 12 minutes. He just did not bring it. It just felt like 2 guys who didn't quite show up in New York. The Zags, they're a good team. They're a deep team, but you can't beat very many good teams when 2 of your starters don't deliver at all. That was the case for them in this one. Zags are still 7-3 on the year. Kentucky, UConn, not bad losses. West Virginia, loss that might age well. We'll see what goes on with them, but nice bounce back for UConn, who really needed to prove that they're still at that level in college basketball, and they did quite convincingly over the last couple of weeks. Like I said, outside of that game, though, not a great weekend for the Big East. The big loss for this team. We're not too, crushed about Creighton losing to Alabama without Pop Isaacs. I think that was more of a expected result, even if Creighton hasn't quite had the season many wanted for them. But Marquette, coming into this game with only 1 loss on the season, gets knocked off by Dayton on the road, a true road game against the Flyers. Marquette loses 71-63. Look, Dayton needs to be ranked. If they're not ranked, if you're listening to this and the AP poll came out and they're not ranked, that's a disappointment. That's a disappointment. It seems 9-2 on the year. Their losses are to Iowa State by, I think, 5 and North Carolina by 2. That's it. They have a win over Marquette, who they just beat. They have a win over UConn, which is aging extremely well after UConn's last couple of weeks. They have a win over Northwestern. This team is playing some really good basketball. And I want to give a special shout out to Shaka Smart, because a lot of high major coaches wouldn't play this game. They might play this game at a neutral site. They might play it at a neutral site in Ohio somewhere, but a lot of teams wouldn't play a true road game against a program like Dayton, even a program with the history and the pedigree and the success that Dayton has. I mean, they're not your typical, for lack of a better word, mid-major team, but still a lot of teams wouldn't do this. I commend Shaka Smart and the Golden Eagles for being willing to play this game, but unfortunately, losing games like this is kind of why coaches don't do this, and I hope it doesn't dissuade them or other programs from playing these types of games, but it does highlight why it's a difficult thing to do. Dayton won on the boards, 38-31 advantage there. They also had 7 turnovers compared to 13 for Marquette. Nate Santos, double-double, 12 and 13, one of 4 Flyers to score in double figures. Meanwhile, Cam Jones, great game, 18 points, 5 assists, 4 boards. Chase Ross had 19, but the front court in particular just did not bring it for Marquette in this loss. Like we said, rough week overall. We got UConn's win over Gonzaga. We got Creighton and Marquette both losing. Creighton to Alabama, Marquette losing to Dayton. The rest of the weekend for the Big East will go a little bit quicker here. Xavier loses their rivalry game in the crosstown shootout to Cincinnati. It was a home game for the Bearcats. They win 68-65. Xavier had won 5 straight in this series. They'd won 9 out of the last 12. I think 13 of the last 18 as well. This is a series that had been recently dominated by Xavier. They go out, they get a loss here. Cincinnati's now 8-1 on the year. Xavier's 8-3. They haven't played great, but they had a lot of chances in this game. In fact, right up to the last minute, Zach Fremantle, I don't know why Wes Miller and Cincinnati didn't foul. I know a lot of teams are anti-fouling up 3, but The worst case possible scenario for Cincinnati was letting one of Xavier's better players get an open look from three. Zach Freemantle was wide open. He missed it. Unfortunate for Xavier, unfortunate for Freemantle, but I don't know how on earth a team as good as Cincinnati gave a opportunity for Xavier to tie this game the way that they did. It was a really disastrous final play for them, but it worked out, and they deserve credit for getting the W. They deserve credit for holding Davion McKnight to just 2 points, and fellow starting guard Marcus Foster for Xavier only had 6. Rough game for the guards for Xavier, and a big-time win for Cincinnati. Meanwhile, Wisconsin beats Butler 83-74 and avoids a 4th straight loss for the Badgers. Pierre Brooks had 23 for Butler, who's now 7-4 on the year. St. Bonaventure, the Bonnies, 10-1 on the year. Another win for the A-10 over the Big East. We had Dayton over Marquette. Then we had St. Bonaventure knocking off Providence, who is now 7-5 on the year. It was a 74-70 final score for the Bonnies. Rutgers beat Seton Hall. Rutgers 7-4 on the year. Seton Hall's 5-6, 66-63 was the final score there. We talked about how Zach Freemantle had a chance to get a game-tying 3 in the final seconds. Dylan Harper got a game-winning 3. Superstar freshman for Rutgers, him and Ace Bailey, once again, did pretty much all the damage. I think they were both over 20 points. I don't think anybody else for Rutgers was more than 10, but Harper got a game-winning look from 3, knocked it down, boom, sends Rutgers to a win, sends Seton Hall under 500 on the year. The 2 other wins for the Big East were by programs that's they're helping now, but they've been at the bottom for a very long time. Georgetown, who's 8-2 on the year, beats Syracuse, who's 5-5 on the year, in kind of a rivalry game there. 75-71, the final score for the Hoyas. Jaden Epps was the star for them, 27 points. Meanwhile, DePaul, the fighting Chris Holtmans, 8-2 on the year as well. They thrashed Wichita State out of the American Athletic Conference, who's also 8-2 on the year, but this game wasn't even close. The Blue Demons win 91-72 behind 23 from Jacob Meyer. It's been a nice, fun, rejuvenating start to the season for DePaul. We don't ultimately expect them to be super competitive once conference play gets going, but on a day where the Big East did not get it done, they went out and beat a decent Wichita State team by 19. That's a nice result for this conference and a much-needed one for a league that's been struggling throughout the year. Well, there was a battle of the Tigers, which was won by Memphis at Clemson. That was a huge, big-time result early in the day on Saturday. We're going to discuss what that means for Penny Hardaway's team and talk about a few other games and how they went down in our weekly six-pack coming up here in just a second. But first, folks, it is that time of year. The college football playoff is back. And with the newly expanded 12-team format, it is guaranteed to be bigger and better than ever, bringing you all the hard-hitting and high-flying excitement that you love. And TNT Sports coverage of the college football playoff begins December 21st, starting with the college football playoff kickoff show presented by AT&T at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Leading into our first matchup, the SMU Mustangs battling the Penn State Nittany Lions at noon. Then the Clemson Tigers look to upset the Texas Longhorns in a showdown at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Don't miss a moment of the action. Watch the college football playoff presented by Allstate live on TNT, True TV, TBS, and Max. All right, folks, segment 3, still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball Podcast. And it's not me and Isaac like it typically is on Mondays, but that doesn't mean we can't still end the show like we always do with a six-pack. We're going to go through 6 other results from the weekend that didn't fit into our conversations about the SEC and the Big East, starting with, again, like I said, a battle of the Tigers. Memphis taking down Clemson on the road. A huge win for Penny Hardaway's club. Overtime, 87-82 was the final score here. Tyrese Hunter was phenomenal for Memphis. He had 23 points. He made 7 3-pointers in this game, was just red hot from beyond the arc. They needed every single one of them. Memphis now 8-2, avenged that loss they had to Arkansas State. This team's been playing some great ball. I know the Arkansas State loss was rough, but this team has been playing really well. To go beat Clemson on the road, something Kentucky was unable to do, really nice result for Hardaway and the Tigers. Meanwhile, for the other Tigers, for Clemson's club, Victor Locken had a great game, 23-11. It's only the second loss for Clemson. They snuck into the top 25. They moved up into the top 25 after the win over Kentucky. I think they're 16th. We'll see what this loss does to them, and we'll see if Memphis is able to sneak in. Recording this before the AP polls come out, but these both feel like top 25-ish teams, kind of right in that bottom part of the top 25, but certainly Memphis deserves some love after getting a hard-fought win here. Next up, UCLA beat Arizona in Phoenix. It wasn't a home game for Tommy Lloyd and the Wildcats, but it was in the Phoenix area. 57-54, the final score, which kind of tells you what you need to know. This is a battle between a slow-paced, methodical, grinded-out type team in UCLA and Mick Cronin, and Tommy Lloyd, who kind of runs that Mark Few style, high-flying, high-octane, high-possession offense. And the team that was able to dictate and set the pace had the likelihood of winning this game. 57-54 is a final score that tells you what you need to know. UCLA set the pace, set their style, dictated what they wanted this game to look like. Tyler Bilodeau, transferred from Oregon State, 17 points, 8 of 12 on two-pointers in this one. These two teams shot it. It was just a brick fest, folks. 6 of 37 combined from three. 29 missed threes between these two teams. UCLA was 4 of 21, but Arizona was just 2 of 16. The Wildcats fall to 4-5 on the year. Been a disastrous season for Arizona up to this point. UCLA, meanwhile, up to 9-1, got themselves a win over former Pac-12 opponent Oregon on the road. Now got themselves a win over former Pac-12 opponent Arizona, sort of on the road, looking real sharp for Mick Cronin's club up to this point. Number 3 in our six-pack, Kansas did what they needed to do, took care of business against NC State, won that game 75-60. Zeke Mayo was phenomenal, 26 points for him on just 9 of 14 shooting. Meanwhile, Hunter Dickinson nearly had a triple-double in this one, 21 points, 14 rebounds. He also tacked on 7 assists for good measure. He did that on a very efficient 9 of 13 shooting. Arguably the best game of Hunter Dickinson's season. He has been good this year, but not great. Hasn't been as dominant as we've seen from him in the past, but he went out and really got it done against this Wolfpack club. Meanwhile, for Kansas, bench wasn't there. Diggy Coit had 3 off the bench. AJ Storr had just 2. That's it. Just 5 total points coming off the bench for Bill Self's club. We know bench scoring and bench depth has been an issue. It was an issue last year that they resolved by bringing in a bunch of talent this year, but we're still not seeing a lot of guys coming off the bench and having success for Kansas, but can't complain about a comfortable 15-point win over a team that was in the Final Four last year. NC State now 7-4 on the year. Number 4, going back to Friday, the Big Ten matchup between Nebraska and Indiana. Expected the Hoosiers to win this one, but it was not the case at all. Nebraska thrashes Indiana. Comfortable 17-point victory for the Cornhuskers. They've now won 4 straight over the Hoosiers. Nebraska ball is alive and well, taking down a prominent program in Indiana. Mackenzie Mbako, just 2 points on 1 of 4 shooting for Indiana. The inconsistency with which Mike Woodson's offense gets him going and gets him the basketball has been just, I'm not an Indiana fan, and it's frustrating for me to watch. I cannot imagine what it is like as a fan to watch this team and just wonder why the heck a guy like with his talent is not getting shot. He had 3 fouls in this game and played just 13 minutes, which, I mean, it's just frustrating to not see this team kind of modernize their game. Now, they did take 35 threes, which is good. That's a far more modern approach. They only made 8 of them. Not so good in that area. Kenan Carlisle, 0 of 5. Luke Goody, 3 of 10. Miles Rice had a great game, 20 points, 8 of 13 shooting, but woof, this Indiana team is really not looking like they have the identity necessary to do well in the Big Ten. Meanwhile, for Nebraska, Bryce Williams, 30 points, 6 boards, 5 assists. They are 7-2 on the year, looking like a really solid start for Fred Hoiberg's club. 2 more results to talk about, both coming out of the Mountain West Conference. Boise State beats St. Mary's 67-65 in overtime. A rough day for the WCC. 2 best programs in that conference take tough losses. 19 points for Tyson Degenhart, 13 points, 11 boards for Omar Stanley for the Broncos, who are now 7-3 on the year. Meanwhile, Augustus Marcelonis, last year's WCC Player of the Year, he had 17 points and 6 assists for the Gales, but they shot under 38% from the field. For a team that plays the style that they do, even when you have a good defensive game, you got to be highly efficient with the basketball. They just weren't able to get it done in this one. Paulus Morauskas, who we've been singing his praise as Arizona transfer, who's been great as kind of the Joshua Jefferson replacement for the Gales. He had just 4 points and 2 boards in 14 minutes, was not able to be productive in this game, and that really, really hurt Randy Bennett's team. And last but not least, one of the few undefeated remaining teams in college basketball, the Aggies of Utah State, comfortable 21-point win over South Florida, 88-67. Utah State's now 10-0 on the year. And it's the best start in school history. And the reason I wanted to highlight them, not only because there just aren't that many undefeated teams left in college basketball, but because what has happened at Utah State in the last little over a half decade has been truly remarkable. Craig Smith spent 3 years at Utah State. He led them to a 74-24 record in his 3 years there. He bounced. He took the head coaching job at Utah. Utah State then hired Ryan Odom, who spent 2 years at Utah State, 44-25 record for him. He takes the head coaching job at VCU. Utah State then hires Danny Sprinkle from Montana State. Danny Sprinkle only spends 1 year at Utah State, leads them to a 28-7 record before he leaves and goes and takes the job at the University of Washington as they move into the Big Ten. And now Utah State hires Jared Calhoun. So again, Craig Smith, Ryan Odom, Danny Sprinkle, combined 6 years. Jared Calhoun comes in, has a better start than every single one of them with a 10-0 record. The ability to continue to make high-profile, highly successful head coach hirings for a program like Utah State. Again, like if Kentucky got 4 straight hires right, you'd be like, okay, sure, but they have more money than anybody. Like Utah State's a small school. They're not even one of the higher resource institutions in the Mountain West. They're moving to the Pac-12. They're going to be in that conference in 2026 when things get going for them again. But for this team to be able to continue to have this level of success on their 4th coach in the last 7 years is truly remarkable and not getting nearly as much press and attention as I think it probably deserves. South Florida is a team that's reeling a little bit, obviously, from the devastating loss of Coach Amir Abdur-Rahim before the season. And they may not end up being a great team this year, certainly not on the level they were last year, but Utah State went out and beat a decent team in a decent basketball conference by 19 to move to 10-0, by 21 to move to 10-0 on the year. This deserves some attention, especially considering the remarkable amount of turnaround in the head coaching ranks this program has had in the last couple of years. That's going to wrap it up for me today here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Folks, thank you so much to those of you who have made this show your first listen or your first watch of the day. I want to give a special shout out to those everyday listeners as well. We will be back later this week. We'll get you ready for it's a kind of a slower week of games again, but we got some fun ones to get to. We'll preview those games. We'll review the excitement. We'll continue to talk about what it means for the NCAA tournament, what it means for these specific conference success stories, all of that and more coming your way later this week. Thanks again for listening, folks. Want to say, as always, apologies to the Lawyer family for their loss against Texas A&M. Let's go Wildcats. Kentucky picked up a big win. Not so much for Arizona. And until Tuesday, peace out.